All right, so this a little introduction to the muscular system. Should be review from anatomy. There shouldn't be anything new, but it might be some information that you haven't looked at or thought about for a while. So, just a quick reminder. If we think about the muscular system, its primary function that we think of is the ability to produce body movements. Along with that production of movements is the idea of maintaining posture and body position. So your muscles have to work for you just to sit or stand or any body position. Some additional functions that you may or may not always think about is just that it helps just to support some soft tissues. We'll look at some examples of that in the respiratory system. It helps to guard body entrances and exits, so closing and opening our mouth is an example. It has a function in helping to maintain our body temperature. It does store nutrients, and then it also helps to facilitate movement of different substances, so circulation of the blood, which is going to be important. We'll talk about that for individuals who are on bed rest. Can end up having blood clots because they're not moving, so that'll be something that'll be important to understand its relationship there. And then movement of food products in the digestive tract. So if you're not used to exercising on a regular basis, and if you start doing so, or if you are used to, you may notice this connection with movement and having appropriate bowel movements, or just your digestive system in general. So there's some relationships there that we will not get into a lot of depth about the physiological, the way that works at the physiological level, but understanding that can be significant for some of our patients that we'll be working with. So just as a reminder, when we talk about muscle tissue in general in the body, there are actually 3 different types of muscle tissue. We are going to be focusing primarily on the skeletal muscle tissue in this class. We will touch a little bit on the cardiac muscle tissue because we will be revisiting and looking at the cardiovascular system and looking at the heart rate and stroke volume and all those kinds of things later in the 8 weeks. And there's also smooth muscle that is associated, again, like with the digestive tract, or it's associated with the circulatory system around the arteries. So we'll be talking most about skeletal muscle, a lot about skeletal muscle, a little bit about cardiac, and a little bit less about smooth muscle tissue. So just having a bit of an appreciation for the difference in how it's structured, and realizing that the structure does impact its function in some important ways. So when we think about the differences between the muscle tissue, we can see here, grab my little laser pointer, as we look at skeletal muscle, we see that we have these long cells with multiple nuclei. And we're going to dive down and look at how it gets all put together into a whole skeletal muscle. But these long cells help with that muscle contraction, so to help create significant movement, not just little movements, but again, to be able to move my finger from here to here, my muscle has to be able to shorten quite a bit. Obviously, in your cardiac all your muscles do that, but your heart's muscle contraction doesn't have to have these big movements. Your knee has to move through a big range of motion. You don't have to do that in your heart. The heart is more about making some contractions that come together like this, so it doesn't need those long fibers. What's more important in the heart is that those fibers, when they contract together, so that you don't get a lot of arrhythmias. And so that's where you get the advantage of these intercalated discs here, which really help make sure that electrical current gets through all of the muscle fibers, so that there's a combined contraction instead of getting what we call fibrillations, where part of the heart's contracting and another part is not. And then in the smooth muscle, you don't have that striated appearance, and again, you're not needing this like movement of an entire structure. It's really more about helping to kind of create either tension or relaxation around different organs. You don't need, you're not moving a lever through an entire range of motion. So again, we'll talk a little bit about smooth muscle in PT, but it's really the skeletal muscle that we need to make sure that we have a real solid understanding about. So here's a little table to kind of distinguish some of the differences. We've already mentioned the location, kind of mentioned the function. Skeletal, as far as looking at the skeletal muscle, it helps obviously with that big movement of our bodies. It helps more with heat production and posture. The cardiac muscle has to be structured so that it can pump continuously, because if your heart stops, it's really not good for you. So we want to have this continuous pumping action, and again, it needs to be able to have a rhythm to it. Not that the entire heart pumps all at the same time. We'll look at that later, but the parts that do contract need to do so simultaneously. You don't have that same need in the skeletal muscle, or even the smooth muscle, quite honestly. So smooth muscle is also known as visceral muscle, visceral being organs, so it's the muscle that's associated with the organs other than the heart. So in the GI tract, the uterus, for helping with delivering babies, in the eyes, around blood vessels, and in the skin. So again, it helps with movement of the food through the digestive tract. It helps with blood pressure. In the eyes, it helps with pupil size, and then in the skin, you have the hair that will stand up again when you're cold or when you get goosebumps, that goose flesh that you get. And then we already looked at the appearance, the distinctions between the appearance. The other important distinction to understand is that skeletal muscle is the only muscle tissue that we have voluntary control over. Cardiac and smooth muscle is involuntary. There are some things that you can do to slow your heart down, cause your heart to be relaxed, but it's not just by thinking, I want my heart muscle to stop. You actually have to kind of do that from a kind of a secondary stress relieving type of activities, breathing exercises, visualization. Whereas with the skeletal muscle, you just think, I want to move my hands, and as long as there is not any condition or disorder, you move your hands. So let's look at muscle cells themselves. Muscle cells have some special properties. I'm sorry, I'm looking around. This is usually where I try to have a rubber band on hand, but I do not have one on hand. So you're just going to have to try to visualize in your mind. So the primary property of muscle cells that we think of is that contractility, so that ability to shorten, or the ability to contract. And so it does that through proteins drawing closer together. We're actually going to look at that in a future video. When you understand that we're talking about contractility, the muscle cell, each muscle cell itself doesn't really shorten. It's just that we have these fibers that kind of move on each other. So again, we'll be looking, and you may remember that from probably from physiology, or maybe you don't, but we'll be looking at that again. It's really important to understand that how the skeletal muscle works in that way. Another property it has is excitability, which just means that it's able to respond to a stimulus. So I can hit my pen all day long and it's not going to respond. But if I were to go, flick my puppy dog on the nose, she would respond. She wouldn't like it. So its excitability is the ability to respond, and that can be through chemical or sometimes mechanical ways. And so we are going to be talking about some different physical therapy intervention strategies where we're going to be capitalizing on the excitability of skeletal muscles through stretching or pressure, things like that. So we're going to be kind of introducing some of those ideas in 155 and really then picking up on those more a little bit in the summer, but mostly in the fall, especially in the neuro class. But you'll be talking about that as well in 230. And that helps with either increasing the likelihood for muscle contraction or decreasing the likelihood of muscle contraction or decreasing the muscle tone or tension. The third property is conductivity. Conductivity is a property that it shares with the nervous system, so its ability to conduct electrical change over its plasma membrane. So it actually, that electrical charge actually moves from one end to the other, conducts it, just like electricity that goes through a wire, or not similar to electricity that goes through a wire. Extensibility, this is where rubber band comes in handy. So extensibility is its ability to be stretched without it breaking. So if you have a rubber band, you stretch that rubber band out. That's the idea of extensibility. And then elasticity is after you stretch that rubber band out, if you let go of the rubber band, you don't have to stretch it real far. You're not trying to hurt yourself. If you just stretch it a little bit and you let go, then it's going to return to its normal length. So extensibility is the ability to be stretched without being injured or ruptured, and then elasticity is the ability to come back to its normal length after that tension has been released. So that's different than contractility. Contractility is an active shortening. Extensibility is a more passive type of lengthening, and then elasticity is a passive return to the resting length. And we'll be visiting that concept a lot in kinesiology. So when we think about the skeletal muscle system, the organs are the muscles themselves. So we want to look at the structure of the organs. So when we think about, if we were to take, let's say we were to take the biceps out of the arm and we were to look at it, we would see that the bicep muscle is made up of, if I can find my little, there it is, made up of these skeletal muscle tissue, or skeletal muscle cells, and then there's connective tissue, series of connective tissue, and then this is showing arterial and venous blood supply. This is not showing a good image of the nervous tissue, but there would also be nerves associated with the skeletal muscle. So those are the different tissues that would make up the skeletal muscle. Mostly the skeletal muscle tissue and the connective tissue. So when we look at the gross anatomy, or the big picture of the skeletal tissue, again we're going to see the skeletal muscle, and there's another video that talks about shapes and fiber arrangements and that kind of stuff. But here's a good example of your biceps. And then we can talk about how that muscle tissue is connected to the bone through some kind of a tendon or tendinous junction. We'll be looking more at tendons later. I don't remember which week, but we'll kind of dive in and look a little bit more at tendons and how they're structured. But when we look at the muscle tissue, so the muscle, one individual cell, like this down here, it's a muscle cell fiber, and again they're very long fibers. And there's several fibers that are kind of bundled together in what would be called a fascicle. So muscle cell fiber is an individual muscle cell. There's several, and again they're long fibers. They're bundled together, so it would be just like if you were to pick up a bunch of, like if you had lots of strings of yarn, or maybe spaghetti, and you were to take a bunch of spaghetti and kind of bundle them together and wrap them with maybe saran wrap or something like that, that would be a fascicle, okay? And so you have this endomycelium, which kind of wraps around these individual muscle fiber cells, and the perimycelium, which wraps around a fascicle. And then you take all of those bundles, all those fascicles, you bundle them together into the entire muscle. And they're wrapped with another layer of connective tissue called the epimysium. And then there's a tough layer of fascia that ends up kind of going into the tendon and then connecting to the bone. So the muscle fascia ends up kind of connecting to that periosteum, or the outside layer of the bone. I do want to just stop and talk about fascia in general. So fascia is this idea of connective tissue that runs throughout the body. And we can talk about layers of fascia around different structures, but in some ways the fascia is kind of like this continuous interconnected network of connective tissue in the body that kind of holds the body together and then divides it into the different parts. So it creates divisions. So you'll hear a lot about fascial tissue in physical therapy. Sometimes you can get, again, injuries, or that fascial tissue can tighten down where it is impeding the ability for the body, for different body parts to move on each other. So sometimes we talk about fascial release techniques, so you'll hear about that more in the fall, or you may have, that may be something that you're familiar with. But you can have different layers of fascia. So you have these superficial layers of fascia that's between the skin and any underlying organs. There's this a layer of fat in between the skin and those organs is kind of part of that. Then whenever you get past that superficial layer, you get into what's called deep fascia. And again, these are those layers of tissue, and they'll have names in different areas of the body depending upon what they're wrapping. But these are ones that kind of wrap around different structures to kind of create barriers, and then to allow those structures to do whatever their job is supposed to be. And it's pretty dense. It's pretty thick and strong, and it really, again, helps to form this internal framework. And then you can have this, what's called a serous fascia, and it is the between serous membranes and deeper fascia. So, I mean, we'll see that more associated with some organs. So most of the time when we're talking about fascia, we're frequently talking about this deep fascia that surrounds different organs. Sounds like my daughter's about to print something. Sorry, my printer's going to be noisy. So again, we get these different fascial layers that surround the muscle in different areas to kind of create boundaries for the muscles. So you get, again, the endomycelium that wraps around the individual muscle cell fibers. Those come together to create a fascicle. So you have the perimycelium around the fascicle. A bunch of fascicles come together for a whole muscle, and you have the epimycelium, epi being like top or outermost, peri being around, endo being inside. So endo, my is muscle, okay? So we have the endomuscle connective tissue around, the most inside one around each muscle cell fiber. Peri is around, so it's wrapped around this fascicle, and then epi would be the most superficial or the topmost layer, so it's around the entire muscle. So this is basically what I just went over as far as the terminology, so this will kind of help you to be able to appreciate and help you, if you understand, again, those medical terms and the prefixes, that can really help you understand the term and be able to figure out where things are. So we'll go over it one more time. So again, you have epi being above or upon. It's kind of the peak, if you will, so it's going to be the outermost. My being muscle, so we get that kind of outside layer around the muscle. Peri being around, so it's going to be around this fascicle, and then endo being within or inside, so it's going to be around each muscle fiber itself, the most inner layer. So that's the gross anatomy. A couple other things to notice is as we get down to the the muscle fibers itself, this you'll see blood vessels. So here we see a vein, and here we see an artery, and then when we get down into the microscopic anatomy, then we're going to start looking at these components here. So these are myofibrils, so they're the fibers that make up the muscle cell. Okay, so the muscle cell is the unit of action of the muscle is the muscle fiber itself right here, and it's made up of further pieces, but they individually don't work. If they were to be pulled apart, they wouldn't work. They have to be put together. So this muscle fiber piece right here is the working cell, but it's made up of further parts. It is set up in these units called sarcomeres, and it is made of these fibers, myofibrils, called actin and myosin. Again, so muscle fibers called actin and myosin. So we'll be looking at some of that in more detail when we actually look at that, what we call it sliding filament theory, so how the muscle works together. And we'll look at those pieces whenever we look at that information.